Hey, what's up folks? Today I'm going to be doing another game analysis from Patreon, analyzing a submitted game from ZWeb, who is about 2080 online and in this game playing a somewhat higher rated opponent. And this was a really interesting French, and the game takes a turn that I think a lot of French games often go into that I think would be really interesting to talk about. So thanks for submitting this game, ZWeb. Starts off with e4, e6, d4, d5, knight to d2. And I recently did a video covering another game in the knight d2 French, the Tarrasch variation, that was submitted by Dan. And in that video, we mainly discuss the lines after c5. So this actually gives us a nice little tour around the French, looking at some different variations. Because in this game, black plays knight f6, which is kind of considered the old main line. And then after e5, bishop d3, c5, c3, all this is very, very normal for the French, knight c6. In this game, white plays the move knight gf3. And yeah, normally the way white players usually like to play this line is they usually put this knight on e2, and they keep the f3 square open for the other knight. And I think this is a absolutely fine way to play, and it's very common because then white gets really nice control over the center. But here ZWeb plays a different way with knight gf3, which has quite a bit of reason to it as well. Now the knights obviously kind of bounce into each other, but usually the idea behind developing this way is that this knight on d2 can still be transferred over to the king side with something like knight f1, and then eventually knight g3, and then all of white's pieces are aimed at the king side. The drawback to this one is that the d4 pawn is now harder to defend, so what many players do as black is they play queen b6 here. Queen b6 is really kind of thematic move in the French, though I would say in a lot of the knight d2 lines, queen b6 is not really appropriate. Like if white had played knight e2 in this position, I actually don't think the lines with queen b6 are any good at all for black, because after knight f3, the d4 pawn is very nicely defended, and actually the queen gets in the way of black's pieces because this bishop on c8 is a really hard time developing. Can't play b6, bishop b7, the knight on d7 is also kind of in the way, and black doesn't really have enough pressure on d4 to justify their play. If we compare this to the advanced French, because it's a similar structure, in the advanced French, the knight on g8 is normally going to the f5 square, which means the d7 square is open for black's bishop, the rook can come to c8, and black gets to develop a lot more freely. Whereas in this case, it's not nearly as clear. That said, after knight gf3, queen b6 here actually makes a lot of sense because it puts pressure on the d4 pawn. And as ZWeb gives in their notes, they usually get this in their games, and then they continue with castles. And yeah, white usually sacrifices this pawn on d4 for pretty good long-term play. After we trade on d4 a bunch of times, white plays knight f3 here. The queen drops back to queen b6, then white plays something like queen a4. It gets kind of a long-term initiative and some pressure for the sacrificed pawn. However, in this game, black decides to play bishop e7, which is another very popular move. White castles, and here black plays a move that I often see at lower levels, c4. And I know this is a very tempting move, not just in French positions, but in similar structures as well, because the players from the black side, they often want to close things down and get into this very closed, blocked up position. And as someone that used to play the French myself, I would sometimes want to do this as well. And the idea is that you just completely shut down the center, you start pushing your pawns on the queen side, and one day you try to castle queen side as well, so your king is safe and not getting mated on the king side. And it's a very tempting strategy for black, but I would say ultimately this is one that is a pretty rough one to kind of rely on, because I feel like white's chances are better. Black is always going to be worse in these positions, and so maybe some players are more comfortable with the closed type of position, but I think in the long run, generally you don't want to be on the black side of this because white just has better chances. And yeah, it might be good for like a blitz weapon, a blitz opening, but I would say, yeah, in general, white should be very happy when black does this. Because the problem with this move is that black is giving up all of the pressure against white's center, and also gives white a free hand to now just move everything to the king side and just attack relentlessly. The way that black normally plays this one, actually, there are some interesting lines here. A lot of French players used to play g5 in this position. And the idea behind this move, although it looks a little crazy, is to actually attack white center with this pawn push to g4. Because it hits the knight has to move away, and then the d4 pawn is under serious pressure. And yeah, there's quite a bit of theory here. I think nowadays this line is considered pretty risky for black for obvious reasons. Black is pushing pawns all over the board, and it's not clear where the king is going to go one day. Generally, white takes on c5 in these positions in order to open up the d4 square, and tries to open up the center to kind of punish black for playing g5. But very, very difficult middle game proceeds from here. In the game after c4, I would say white gets a very comfortable game, but even so, it's not so easy to win these kinds of positions. So ZWeb plays bishop to b1, which is kind of logical because I think they wanted to put their queen on c2. But the thing to understand is that black is pretty much never going to castle kingside here. It's just they realize it's way too dangerous. And so even if white does play bishop c2 and then black castles, I think you could afford to give up the tempo here, play bishop b1, queen c2, and white would still have an incredibly nice position. And this is one of the points about playing a closed position, is that you can afford to lose a tempo without really losing out on all that much. The value of a tempo is much lower. So from white's point of view, I would recommend actually putting the bishop on c2 here, and this is what most players usually do when they have this kind of structure, because the bishop on b1, it actually can get in the way of the rook. Sometimes you want your rook on the b file, or to be able to join the party with rook a e1. This bishop often supports a possible break of b2, b3, and this is something that white kind of wants to keep in their back pocket, because if black one day castles queenside and you're trying to attack the king, this b3 pawn break is something that could be very useful, and then the bishop can support it. It can also come out to a4 one day. So in general, I would say the bishop is better placed here on c2. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how white should play these kinds of positions. Generally, what black does is they do something like b5. In this game, black plays a6, which I think is a particularly slow move in these positions. I think black should just calmly play b5, a5, and try to push on the queen side. And there's a couple different ways for white to create some play here. I would say the classic plan is to play rook e1 and then do this kind of like Ruy Lopez style maneuver, knight f1, knight g3, and even try to play knight h5 one day to force a weakening on the king side by attacking the g7 pawn. We see kind of a similar idea in the game as well. For example, after knight b6, knight f1, let's say a5, knight to g3. There are quite a few games that go like this, and somewhat surprisingly, actually, most players as black here play the move h5, stopping the idea of playing knight h5, because if black were to just do something else like bishop b7 or queen c7 or something like that, then white should go ahead and play knight h5 here and force black to weaken the g7 pawn. Now after g6, I'm not sure if white should go ahead and jump in. I think this is a pretty risky play because the knight can get stuck on g7, but I think even if white just drops back like knight f4 or even knight to g3, the fact that we've weakened a lot of these dark squares, I think, gives white a lot of room to play for here. So queen d2, after bishop h6, then white can fight for the dark squares. There's also h4, h5 ideas, and I think white just has an excellent game on the king side. So this is one way of playing, is just trying to bring the knight to g3 and then knight h5. The other way that I think is pretty effective is using the h-pawn. And a lot of players will go ahead and just sack the h4 pawn, like in this position, for example. And it's not a real sacrifice because black doesn't have to accept it. They can ignore this one. But if black ignores the sack, then after h5 and h6, the h-pawn can cause a lot of problems in black structure. And that's the idea for white, is just using this h-pawn to try to create some weaknesses. And if black does take on h4 here, then the problem is that black is losing the dark squared bishop. So what players have figured out in these kinds of positions is that trading off black's dark squared bishop is often worth a pawn here. And there's different continuations for white. You could play like knight f3 and play for bishop g5 and using the super powerful bishop that way. You can also play a move like b3 here and trying to get the bishop to a3 and to d6. Basically, very, very good and strong long-term compensation here from white's point of view. So this is just a thematic sacrifice I kind of wanted to point out. It's very typical in this and other types of positions as well, to sacrifice this pawn in order to get the dark squared bishop. The rook can also be on e1 here, and then after the trades on h4, what a lot of players do is they'll then lift the rook with like rook e3, and then the rook can be used on the third rank. So that's kind of the two plans I would focus on for white in these positions. I think they're both very reasonable and give white a good position. Rook e1 followed by knight f1, knight g3, and also playing h4, h5, and just trying to create some weaknesses using the h-pawn. So in the game we get bishop to b1, and here black plays a6, which I think is a pretty slow move because black can just go ahead and play b5 without preparing it, and then a5, b4, and so on. And here white kind of follows suit with h3. Though I like this move more because this one actually comes with the idea of using the h2 square for white's knight and then bringing out the queen, which I thought was a pretty reasonable plan that's played in the game. Once again, I would suggest one of the two plans I mentioned before, like rook e1, knight f1, or h4 here, I think is quite a reasonable move. One idea I didn't mention behind h4 is that it also secures the g5 square for one of white's knights. So for example, black plays like b5, knight to g5. This is an idea that I think white should keep in mind. And here it's important to point out that the knight is putting pressure on a lot of these kingside weaknesses. If black plays h6 here, there's a very typical sacrifice, knight takes e6, that pretty much wins the game for white. After takes, bishop g6 check, the queen is coming out to f3, and black is going to have to give back a piece just to avoid getting mated, and white just has fantastic attacking potential here. And then the plan is, again, rook e1, knight f1, knight g3, bring more pieces to the king side and try to create a powerful attack. So that's another idea behind pushing the h-pawn early, is that you can secure the g5 square for the knight. If black takes twice on g5, then once again white uses the compensation. Since we've taken the dark square bishop, here it's not even just compensation. White can just immediately win the pawn back because of the discovered attack, and then get the knight to d6, and white is just crushing. But even without this tactic, I would say white has very nice long-term compensation when we've given up a pawn for that dark square bishop. So yeah, once again, I think this was kind of the strongest approach here from white's point of view, followed up by either h5, h6, or knight g5 ideas, and then bringing all of the pieces into the attack, like queen f3 or knight f3, and so on. The way the game goes is pretty interesting as well. White plays h3, b5, knight h2, bishop b7, and queen g4. And pretty interesting move, queen g4, because it forces black to make a decision. Either black has to commit the king to castling, which I think would be extremely dangerous, then white just brings all of the pieces in, and yeah, everything is aimed at the king side. I think this would be very, very dangerous for black. From here, like, you could play queen h5 and knight g4, and yeah, I think black would be just very close to getting mated. So instead, black plays g6, but now weakens the king side quite a bit, and white starts using this, knight df3, queen c7, and knight g5. Very nice move because it attacks f7, kind of ties black down to this one, and now black can't castle without losing this pawn. So black isn't able to quite get their setup right here. After a little bit of thinking, black does take on g5, giving up the dark square bishop, and I feel like white absolutely is able to get what he wants here. Now, Ziwa mentions in the notes after h6, the idea was to go ahead and sack on f7, and yeah, this is a typical sacrifice that you want to be ready to make in these kinds of positions. If you can sacrifice a piece for 2 or 3 pawns and completely open up the king, it's usually worth it. And I actually thought it was interesting here in the annotations, what ZWeb writes is that they were calculating all this and then trying to calculate further, and wasn't sure if it was clear enough or not. Looked at bishop takes h6, queen takes, king e8, and yeah, ZWeb writes that they were kind of hoping for more, and they kind of dismissed the sacrifice. But upon playing it out on the board, realized that actually it's very strong. And indeed, yeah, white is totally crushing here. Just a ton of pawns for the material. It's like rook versus 2 pieces, and the e6 pawn is hanging. And yeah, the problem for black is that all the pieces are just stuck on the queen side, and white just has these massive king side pawns that are pretty much going to be unstoppable here. So yeah, white has a very, very nice initiative. The bishop can get back into the game as well with bishop to g6. I think there are other ways of playing this position as well. I think in general, good rule of thumb when you're trying to evaluate is like, well, if the king seems like it's cut off, like the queen is doing a great job and you can quickly get more pieces into the attack, usually you're going to be doing pretty well. Another plan that could possibly be very strong is just playing like f4, f5, and trying to open up the rook on the f-file. And yeah, if black can't evacuate their king in time, then this could just be an absolutely devastating plan as well. So it's possible this was a rapid game. It's possible we spent a little bit too much time kind of calculating and trying to figure this out. I would often think of this almost as like an intuitive sacrifice where it's just got to be good for white. You're getting so many pawns and opening up the king that it should be worth it. But yeah, just interesting to see that these things are not always so clear for the player when they're actually in the game. But a good thing to kind of analyze for our thought process. So in the game after takes, white ends up getting the dark squared bishop, but black plays h6 here and tries to kick the bishop away. And it seems like ZWeb kind of misses the opponent's idea, which is to castle queenside. And yeah, here the game starts turning a little bit in terms of the direction. What white, I think, should have done here was either keep the bishop on this diagonal and force black to weaken themselves even further before they're allowed to castle. And then at least white gets kind of an extra hook for the pieces, and you can play like f4 here, or maybe queen h5 first, and then f4, and I still think white gets quite good play on the f-file. Or perhaps even stronger would be this nice move queen h4, which keeps the bishop on g5, stopping the king from castling, and also pins the h-pawn, which means that it's very difficult for black to do anything here. And if black plays h5, then the bishop on g5 is now secure, and black's king is just going to be a sitting duck on e8, and white can slowly build up either some kind of pawn break. Even knight g4 seems possible here, trying to get on in on the f6 square. And yeah, I think white would just have like a fantastic game. So we end up going back, and now after castles, white plays queen h4, trying to go for knight g4, knight f6. Black plays g5 here. We go queen h5, and now f5. And so black is fighting back on the king side, and I think actually the game gets pretty interesting. White takes en passant, which I think was correct. You got to kind of keep the position opened up for the two bishops. Knight takes f6, and here white starts to go wrong a little bit. So white plays queen g6, queen e7, knight g4. And what ends up happening here is that white just continues to play on the king side, but doesn't fully appreciate, in my view, the fact that black is ready to start creating counterplay against white's king. So this is one of those weird positions where it's like the structure dictates that white should be playing on the king side. We have this like French structure, black's bishop is stuck on b7, all of our pieces are pointed at the king side. Kind of makes sense for white to be playing on the king side, but at the same time, you have to be very careful, because if things open up too much, then it's going to be white's king on g1 that gets caught in the crossfire of black's rooks, right? So we have to be very, very careful about how exactly we play on the king side. And that's kind of what happens in the game here, is that I think white ends up overextending a bit. We get a trade on g4, rook g8, queen h5, and now really strong move from black, knight to b8. Just a fantastic idea. Transferring the knight to d7 and f6, where it kind of fights for some key kingside squares, and really starts fighting back on the king side. So what should have white done instead? I think rather than trying to get in with the queen on g6, where it feels like it's just asking to get kicked one day, I think white had to pull back, something like queen to e2, and then look to create this f4 break, which doesn't quite open up the king side as much as a move like knight g4 does later on, as eventually black gets the open h-file. But with f4, I feel like white would do a great job of opening up the kind of unopposed dark square bishop, also opening up the f-file for the rook. At some point, white should probably play bishop c2 and get this rook back into the game. And yeah, white could put pressure on this kind of backwards pawn on e6. And I think white still retains a pretty sizable advantage here. But this would be kind of the way I would approach this position, is you don't want to do too much on the king side, because, again, you're never sure if you're going to be opening up a ton of files to your king. And so yeah, this is kind of what happens in the game. White ends up playing f4 in this position. Now black goes knight d7, bishop c2, white needs a tempo to get the rook back in, knight f6, queen h3, queen d6, and yeah, now the game is getting a little bit messy. White plays what seems to be a very natural move, rook ae1, and now black opens up all the counterplay with h5. So very, very strong move, opening up the rooks on the files, wanting to play h takes g4, and now things are actually looking very, very scary from white's point of view, because black is opening the h file, the queen on d6 is eyeing this h2 square, and yeah, white's two bishops don't seem to be in a good position to defend against all this. So white ends up playing fg5. Black goes h takes g4, and then we get into some pretty messy but quite interesting tactics, as white now goes bishop f4, which I think was kind of white's idea when they took on g5. And yeah, now there's a big mess, but it's very interesting actually, because black plays queen takes f4, which looks like a very reasonable move, with the idea that when white recaptures, black will take on h3, and then white will win back the piece on f6, but black will have some counterplay. And here actually white misses a very, very interesting tactical shot. So if you guys want to pause the video and think for a little bit, white to play and win, I think this would be a very good tactical exercise, because it's really, I would say, not so obvious of a tactic, but good for training purposes. Okay, if you want more time, definitely pause the video. So here white could have played queen takes h8, which is a very surprising type of Desperado, right? This is a Desperado tactic. Both queens are hanging, and they're both trying to take as much material as they can on their way out before white is able to recapture. But this is a very counterintuitive move, I would say, because it seems like black is the one that's first. Black plays queen takes f4. Now white just needs to recapture, and then simplifications will continue. But instead, white had to play queen takes h8 here, threatening the knight on f6, of course threatening to take the queen as well. And the point is that after queen takes f1, black is now grabbing another rook. White recaptures on f1 and is winning back the piece on f6. So black has to play rook takes h8, then white can take on f6. I think you can also take with the pawn here, but taking with the rook seems stronger just to keep everything super active. And then white would just have a fantastic endgame. Pawn is coming to g6, where the pawn is going to be super strong and supported by the bishop. And very importantly, white's king here, super close, and it can just immediately get in on the dark squares. And if the king gets to e5, then it's just going to be positional domination from white's point of view, as black's light square bishop this whole time has remained really bad. So really not an easy calculation to see, or not an easy tactic to spot. The other thing white would have had to have seen to play this one is that if black makes a move with the queen, then white has queen takes f6 and is winning a lot of material as we snag this rook on h8. So yeah, very, very uncommon type of Desperado when you take a piece and it's not check, but seemed to have worked out from white's point of view. So what black needed to do on bishop f4 was actually take on h3 here. Then after bishop takes g6, h takes g2, white can play rook takes f6 here, but then black has rook h1 check and is actually okay, because king f2, rook takes e1, and then the pawn is promoting. So white needs to take here first, black can take on e1, and white is down the exchange but has some very reasonable compensation, I would say, and is probably doing just fine. After king f2, bishop f4, I would say white still has a pretty comfortable position here. But okay, those were the complications. Obviously those are going to happen regardless of the game and what happens earlier in the opening. At some point things always open up, and there's always going to be something to calculate. And I bring this up because in their notes, ZWeb mentions that they feel like they let the advantage slip, but then the main reason that they kind of lost their advantage here is because they failed to calculate correctly in the critical moment. And that's kind of true. This is a tactic here after queen takes f4, queen takes h8 that we would like to be able to find. But then we get into kind of a tricky discussion when it comes to time management. Like, this was a rapid game. Not sure how much time white had at this point, but if it's something like, 1 or 2 minutes or just like a couple minutes, that's not a lot of time to find like really tricky tactics. And sometimes the time management comes earlier, where it's like you have to conserve time by playing a little bit faster, and then you have more time when the game ends up opening up later on. But this is a really tricky balance to strike, because some players, they like to think a little bit longer out of the opening and make sure that they're playing good moves. But then when it comes to the critical moment later, you're down on time and you don't have time to calculate. Other players, they like to be a little bit more intuitive when they play out of the opening, especially in rapid chess. They try to play a little bit faster, and on the plus side, now you have more time when the game sharpens up later on and we get into complications. But of course, the downside is that if you play a little bit too fast out at the opening, you might fall into a bad position or blunder something, and then of course you're taking that risk. So it's a very fine line to walk. I don't think there's any kind of perfect solution, just a matter of finding the balance and learning how to manage your time and spend time when you need to, but also being able to conserve time when you feel like you can just get your plan going and make moves quickly. So yeah, players always wonder like, oh, how do I get better at like calculating in time pressure? I feel like I don't calculate well, but I would say that's actually something that's very, very common. Most players do worse under stress when they're in time pressure. And so my advice is to always like try to play a little bit faster, not too fast. You want to spend time, make sure you're making good moves, but you want to also avoid time pressure as much as you can, because most of us, we just end up doing a lot worse when we get into that time pressure. And at that point, it's a total toss-up. You could have a good position, but when the clock starts ticking down, of course, crazy things can happen. So in the game, white ended up just recapturing on f4. Black played g takes h3. White played rook takes f6. And now after rook takes g5, black is actually more than fine, as black has won this key g pawn. The second rook is coming to g8, and white has to defend g2. And so black ended up a little bit better here. And once white unpinned here with king to h2, decides to trade everything off. I think at this point, actually, if black wanted to keep some winning chances alive, they needed to keep the rook on the board. Something like rook h8 check or rook f8. And then black can try to use their extra pawn. As it happens, rooks were traded in the game with rook g2, king takes g2. And black wasn't really able to do anything with their extra pawn here, as all the pawns are on one side of the board. It's very difficult to win these endgames or create any kind of serious winning chances, especially because white has all their pawns on the dark squares, so it's hard for black to attack these pawns with their bishop. And so black tried e5 here and gets the king in, but once white gets the king to e3, pretty much impossible for black to break through here, and white was able to eventually hold the game. So really interesting game. Thanks for submitting this one. I thought it was a good chance to talk about how to play these kinds of positions where black plays c4 and kind of closes everything up. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I think that's going to be it. So, okay, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.